Hi, welcome to this week's video. I recently watched a film. It's an old classic, one I've seen many times, and I have to say I watched once again and thoroughly enjoyed. It was The Man That Never Was. It tells the story of deception. It tells the story in a time of war when to try and get one up on your enemy may save countless thousand lives. Following watching that film, I decided to have a look to see other plots, other feats of deception and measures that people went to try and deceive the enemy. Not just in the Second World War, but as that film depicts, but throughout military history. I was intrigued to stumble across a story. Now, there are many stories, and indeed future videos may feature a few of them. I was intrigued by quite a few, but one really caught my eye. I've always been told, I don't know about yourself, but the Gallipoli campaign, when Allied forces tried to take the Dardanelles, tried to take Gallipoli, it was a huge failure, massive failure. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were on holiday. We went on a bit of a road trip and we called in at Sandringham. I'd never been to Norfolk before. We called in at Sandringham, and there is a monument, and it's to the Sandringham Regiment. They were a group of men that served on the Sandringham estate, but also formed part of a territorial division of the 5th Norfolk Regiment. And the king gave permission for them to join the troops that were going out to Gallipoli. None came back. In fact, although they only landed in the early part of 1915 on the beaches of Gallipoli, by August 1915, the Allies had suffered nearly 57,000 casualties. As many nearly were wounded. And nearly as many, when you start looking at all the facts and figures, had suffered due to typhoid and due to dysentery and due to frostbite. And in some cases, because obviously it's trench warfare, when the snow started to melt, then they were almost drowning. It was horrendous. They were facing Turkish forces. The Allies were way beyond an overwhelming force. When Kitchener sent that force to Gallipoli, he sent it as an exceptionally large force. It comprised of Canadians and Australians and British forces, New Zealanders, Indians, French. They massed on these beaches in Gallipoli. They dug in and they tried to advance. The thing is that 60,000 Turks held a very commanding high position. And yes, the Allies did progress somewhat, but they couldn't take that high ground. Not only that, there were very narrow gullies, and there was a lot of thick, dense shrubbery and vegetation. It was a sniper's dream. And so for any platoon, any regiment to try and break through the Turkish lines, they were just sitting ducks. This went on and went on until, coming towards the end of 1915, a couple of major generals decided, they were Major General Bridges and Godley, they decided this is a waste of time. We'd be far better pulling out. And so they give the order, pull out. Problem. If you start to withdraw, and do you think the Turks are just going to sit there? Do you think they're just going to let you walk off the beach onto your boats? No, they're going to pursue. And once again, you'd be sitting ducks. Now, both these major generals, they sat down and they estimated losses. And they decided that, well, anywhere between potentially 40 and 50% could be lost. So some 45 to some 57,000, an equal number that's already been lost, 57,000 casualties. Well, a price worth paying if we can get the rest off. On the scene comes a man of, well, he's a career soldier. He has held some high-ranking positions. He has even held some positions for royalty. He is a Lieutenant General William Birchwood. Genius, in my opinion. He'd seen action. He'd been in action in Gallipoli. He commanded his troops from the front. He wasn't just sitting in an office commanding or bellowing commands. He decided that he would lead from the front. He tried to break through them Turkish lines. He knew what the Turkish defences were. He knew what trying to go through those tight gullies was like. He realised that this could not be done. As a result, he was instructed to get them off the beaches. How do you do it? How do you pull what's left, some now 114,000 troops, Allied troops, off the beaches without those 40 to 50% significant losses that the brigadier generals, or the major generals rather, were prepared to consider? Any Turkish advance, even by just a few yards in some places, would have seen them in the British lines. And any significant advance, the British would be just, or rather the Allies would be just sitting ducks. So they couldn't be allowed to advance at all. They had to believe, while he was getting all these troops and all the supplies off these beaches, the Turkish forces had to believe that it was the status quo, that nothing was changing, that the Allied forces were just as numerical and just as active as ever they had been. And so he came up with a plan. He had ships coming up to the beaches, and offloading on a daily basis were supplies, just as they would normally, except the supplies were just bags of sawdust, or they were crates full of sand. And they had mules, they had donkeys that were going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, carrying these boxes and carrying these sacks of sand and sawdust, just going round and round and round. Great deception. If you can imagine, if suddenly people start pulling back, the trenches, the forward trenches, first off, would fall silent. Turks, they're not stupid. They would think to themselves, I think them trenches are empty. Let's go and have a look. And they would soon find that sure enough, those trenches are empty. In which case, they're retreating. Let's go pursue. So he ordered absolute silence in the trenches. Not a sound was to be heard. And sure enough, the Turks fell for it. And sure enough, they advanced. But he'd actually armed all those men. He hadn't pulled back a one, and he'd armed them to the teeth. And they just let fly with a hail of bullets. And it ended up the Turks retreating back to their lines. Now, you only have to do that a couple of times when the old Turks think, this is a ploy. We're not going to fall for that one again. So when the actual trenches do fall silent, they stayed put. Not only that, but one of the things that was common during the First World War was to employ miners. They dug underground through what is effectively no man's land into the opposing territory and set off mines. Now, whenever that took place, it was always in advance of a major surge forward. And so he even had miners dig those tunnels and set off mines, so the Turks would believe that there was a major advance coming. And on top of that, even when he'd managed to get all the men off, because as these ships are coming in by day with these fake supplies, they're going out of a night full of men and actual supplies. And he left in the trenches guns, some field guns, but also rifles set up around, and they had cans. There was a can of water with just a tiny little hole, and that was then falling into another can, and that was on a piece of string attached to the trigger. So as it slowly filled with water, the weight would pull on the trigger and the gun would fire. The result was this. That man, Lieutenant General William R. Birchwood, he managed to pull off the impossible. He managed to get every one of the 114,000 men off that beach without a single life lost. That's clever. That's real deception. But that is clever. Every man saved. When I read that, I instantly thought of a verse from the Bible. It is found in 2 Timothy. Sorry, it's found in 1 Timothy. It is in 1 Timothy and chapter 2, and it is verse 4. And it reads like this. Who, that is God, will have all men to be saved and to come unto the knowledge of the truth. God had a plan for you and me, because we were in a far worse condition than the Allied troops. They were pinned down in trenches. We are on our way to a lost eternity. We're on our way to hell because of sin. And we could do nothing about our sin, but God had a plan. And that plan required that his beloved Son should take our place and be crucified upon Calvary's cross and bearing the wrath and the judgment that your sin and my sin deserves. And by believing on him, Paul tells Timothy, God would have all men to be saved. All men. Now I know that not everybody believes in God. And I know that not everybody believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's the tragedy of it. Because God, out of his love for them, sent his Son into the world to die for them. And he would have all men turn to him in repentance. And he would have all men to be saved. And I pray and I trust that you would put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. That you would be saved. And that you would know what it is to have sins forgiven and peace with God. God bless.